What's up, everyone? We'll let people roll in here. I know it's now 3 o'clock, but we'll just let people keep piling in. Hey, Rory, glad you're here. All right. Taylor, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Good. Jordan, I hope so, man. You're gonna have to. I'm excited for this one because I get to do a lot of listening and learning from you guys. Kevin, are you here?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, just give me 1 second here.
No problem, man. All right. What's up, dude?
How's it going?
It's going pretty well. How are you?
Oh, I'm hanging in there.
Yeah. Well, let's just, like I say, we go ahead and jump into this thing. Okay. So thanks for joining us, guys. Thanks for joining us on your Friday. And with all of the things going on in the world, we thought it would be nice to put one of these together again and just get everybody, talking about some cool stuff and having some fun and just having a little bit of an enjoyable time as a community. So here we are. If you're new to the Journal Club or the Clinical Athlete Community in general, welcome. So as far as participating in these meetings, you have a few options. You can raise your digital hand. There should be an icon there. If you just kind of like scroll through your Zoom panel, you should see some type of thing that looks like this or something that you can raise your hand with, and we can actually call on you and we can unmute you and you can join in the discussion via audio, kind of like a radio show, which is always cool. And if you don't want to do that, but you still have a question or kind of a talking point to throw out there, you can do that in the Q&A box. So you'll notice that there's both a Q&A and a chat. Use the Q&A for very specific questions or talking points that you want us to hit on. But we want you guys to use the chat for just kind of running discussion and talking shop amongst yourselves as well, kind of like what you guys are doing right now. Or just little, feelers that you want to throw out there. Just know that the chat buries itself. So if you have a question or a comment that you want us to touch on, make sure you put it in the Q&A box. And if you just want to listen and soak in all the conversation as an active listener, you can, of course, do that too. So these meetings are always open to anyone that wants to join in. We do put these meetings inside the Clinical Athlete Forum, along with all of the other great resources in the forum in regards to athlete health and performance. If you want to check out the forum, you can always do that. And I'll put a link in there for the applications to the forum. So if you want to check that out at any time, you can do so. And then you should have been able to get the paper, but I'll throw in the ResearchGate link there as well. Hey, Shelby, this is Shelby's, shout out to Shelby for suggesting this paper, by the way, in the forum. So this is thanks to her that we're looking into this topic in this paper specifically. So if you click that link in the chat that I just hit there in the ResearchGate link, then you can download the paper. And then a quick note on sound. If you were unmuted to join the conversation and then later on you're not speaking anymore, but you're still unmuted, just try to remember to mute yourself because your background information or your background noise can come through, even if you're like pouring a glass of water or whatever it is, we can hear it. Sometimes it's distracting for people. So just keep that in mind. Okay. And then we still need a meeting scribe. We've had the last 2 or 3 meetings in a row, we've had people that email me after the meeting and they email me their notes, which is awesome. So we're looking for a meeting scribe to just, if you already take notes during these meetings, you can just send those over to me. And what we do with those is they get posted in the forum along with the recording so people can kind of follow along. It doesn't have to be anything crazy, just like bullet points or summary points of the discussion, just big heavy hitters. And you can email those to, I'll put my email in the chat as well. Sorry about the typing noise. There it is. Okay. And then, so if we have a volunteer for that, you can throw it in the chat, or you can just send me an email. But with all of that said, welcome to the Clinical Athlete Journal Club meeting number 21. My name is Quinn Hennick, and I'm a proud clinical athlete provider. And as always, I'm joined by Kevin McNamara, who's a physical therapist completing a residency at Johns Hopkins. He's a longtime forum member and is the one responsible for bringing this whole journal club thing to life. So thanks for being here, Kevin, as always.
Of course, man. Happy.
Glad to have you. And we have Taylor Allen Fladdock back for her second meeting, and she's a clinical athlete intern, and she did an awesome job last time of just helping us curate the questions, and that was extremely, extremely helpful. She'll be here with us again tonight, which we're excited about. So if you are wondering about the impetus for these meetings and why we do these things, way back in the day, a smart guy named Benjamin Franklin started a weekly club that was called the Junto Club, and it was a mutual improvement club, quote unquote. But it was basically just a room full of really smart people discussing topics and issues of the day, kind of like what we're doing here in regards to athlete health and performance. But they had an important policy, and that policy was that all discussions would be conducted in the sincere spirit of inquiry after truth, without fondness of dispute or desire of victory. So we're all on the same team. We're just out here trying to be less wrong. Discussion and disagreement are okay, and they're even encouraged. It's just that you're not necessarily coming in to win. You're coming in to learn, and that's where we all want to be with this stuff. Oh, right. Tonight's journal club topic is energy systems development, and specifically the paper that we're going to talk about is titled "The Effects of High Intensity Interval Training in Combat Sports, a Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis." And again, this paper was recommended by Shelby, who's in the group tonight, and this came out recently, 2020. I'm not sure on the month, but lead author is Breno Vasconcelos and crew. I'm not sure where they're based. It looks like Brazil, potentially. Oh, they got all over the place. United Kingdom. So pretty diverse group of authors there. But before we get digging into the paper, I've got a couple poll questions. And actually, Taylor set these up. But we'll launch this poll just to get a feel for the room. So question one, you should see a poll pop up in front of you. Question one is, who are you? Clinician, student clinician, coach trainer, student coach trainer. So if you can pop an answer in the chat or in the poll, it helps us kind of get a feel for the room. And then question two, do you usually program any type of high intensity interval training for your athletes? And if not, did reading this paper make you rethink utilizing high intensity interval training for your athletes? Give you guys a few seconds to answer those questions. Looks like we've got about 50% clinician, a little more, 20, maybe 25% student clinician, 20% trainer. Cool. So we got a good mix. And then 7% student coach trainer. I'll go ahead and end this so you guys can see. And then 70% of you guys said that, yes, you usually do program some type of high intensity interval training for your athletes. And for those who didn't, the 30% that said no, 80% of you said that after reading this paper, you might rethink that. So cool. Okay. I'm excited for this one. I think I already said this on the air, but I'm excited because I get to do a whole lot of shutting up and listening to you guys, because energy system development is not my wheelhouse. I've primarily, last 3 or 4 years, primarily worked with barbell sport athletes, and we don't do a lot of conditioning. I mean, that's something maybe we can get into in regards to that, but it's nothing like what the cohort of combat sport athletes would need to deal with. So this was an interesting topic for me, and I'm excited to learn from you guys all about this. But we can just kind of dig into the overview of the paper, and then I'll throw it out to the crowd. But essentially, so this is a systematic review and a meta-analysis. So they systematically gather a bunch of articles on a particular topic, and they score the bias in these articles, and they kind of give us a nice tabled rundown of what they looked at in each one of these papers. And so it's like you've got a specific question. Let's look at all the articles that are answering or hoping to answer that question. And then here they are in a summarized fashion, in a systematic fashion. It's really, really nice. So these articles, it's one thing to read these articles by themselves, but these things can serve as references for you. So, in this article in particular, you could spend a lot of time just digging into the papers that they included in the actual review article and get a better context for these things. And then the meta-analysis part is they actually do kind of a study of the studies. And so they pool the data and all of the mean differences between the groups of all these studies, and they aggregate an effect size for whatever they're looking at. So those are all those forest plots that you probably saw in the back half of the paper, and we'll go through that stuff too. But essentially, the question that they're trying to answer, the aim of this paper was to assess the currently available high-intensity interval training related research in combat sports and perform a systematic review and meta-analysis on the chronic effects of high-intensity interval training protocols on combat sport athletes to better inform researchers and practitioners working within these sports. And they included some non-Olympic combat sport athletes too, because they cited a systematic review that kind of answered the same question, but only in Olympic sports. And so now they're including non-Olympic sport combat sports. So as we're just kind of digging in here, they ended up including 12 articles total. And their outcome measures that they were looking at were, in the systematic review, they looked at a lot of stuff: heart rate, blood lactate concentration, before and after a training block, anaerobic power, aerobic capacity, body comp, and like body mass and percentage of body fat. And then in the meta-analysis, where they were actually able to pool all of the data from these studies and create kind of an aggregate effect size, they looked at VO2 max, peak and mean anaerobic power, body mass, and percentage of body fat. So I'm going to kind of just fast forward to the main results that we can dig into. And essentially, the main findings seem to be from the meta-analysis that VO2 max and anaerobic power, measured on things like a Wingate bike test, are the variables most affected by this training method of high intensity interval training when compared with other variables like the heart rate and blood lactate concentration, aerobic capacity, all of those other things. So the things that they saw the most effect on after a training block of high intensity interval training was VO2 max and anaerobic power. We can parse out a lot of the other stuff, but if you just look in the back half of the paper, you can see those forest plots, and those are the graphs or the plots that you see with the dot, which is the mean of the study, and then the confidence interval bars. And you see that black diamond, which is the pooled effect size. And you're really looking for that black diamond to be more on one side than the other. If it crosses that 0 line, you take a little bit of a pause with that, because it's basically saying, well, the true value could be on either side of not doing the intervention or doing the intervention. So you like to see kind of a clear delineation of that diamond, that black diamond. And you can see that with absolute aerobic power. So I kind of misspoke there, aerobic power. And no, I was right. Aerobic power is VO2 max, sorry. Anaerobic power and VO2 max. But even with anaerobic power on page 895 on the actual document, but you see that black diamond crosses over a little bit into the pre-intervention, but it looks like the biggest effect was anaerobic power tested with a Wingate test on the bike, and aerobic power, or VO2 max. So you might also ask yourself, well, what does high intensity interval training actually mean? And that's where you look into some of these tables where they have all 12 studies. And that's one of the problems with a meta-analysis that doesn't have a lot of studies in it, is that you get a lot of heterogeneity. And I don't actually know if they measured that because they said that they measured heterogeneity with I squared, but I didn't actually see a value of that in the results. But my guess would be that it was pretty high, because a lot of these studies, they're studying different sports: karate, wrestling, judo, jiu-jitsu, taekwondo, and the interventions are they're different, you know. They're relatively the same in regards to their conditioning programs, but there's just a lot of different ways to go about it. So just because they didn't find a lot of difference in some of these variables, a lot of that could just be because the samples are so small, and we're trying to answer a specific question when these studies went about it, you know, in different ways. So that's just a very general overview of the paper. Still a really good reference. I thought they did a good job of putting together the paper in regards to their methodology. And the studies that go into the paper are just the studies that go into the paper. That, you know, they did the best they can finding the studies that answer the question. But I thought that the methodology in the paper was pretty good. Kevin, what do you think about this one?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I think the results were really surprising necessarily. To me, I think this kind of gets into a discussion that is a good one to have, and it's on just kind of understanding dose response, right? So kind of the magnitude of the characteristic of the reaction or the response of the organism based off of the specific makeup or the volume of the stressor. And I think that kind of plays out in terms of we're prescribing, you know, glycolytic training. I would expect, you know, if it's done correctly, because I do think that oftentimes it is not prescribed or executed properly. I would anticipate we would hopefully make some sort of improvements in anaerobic power. So to me, I think they did a pretty good job kind of collecting data, you know, for what it is. That's always kind of the problem with a systematic review or a meta-analysis. It's not the fault of the authors on the SR, but it's just, here's the data and this is kind of what we found. So I wasn't necessarily too surprised. I would kind of follow up your comment on heterogeneity. I know they marked it as 50%, but even just like a quick like control F, I didn't see where they actually listed how much heterogeneity was found.
The funnel plots are there, but I didn't see an actual value. The funnel plots are towards the end of the paper, and some of them are pretty asymmetrical. But yeah, I didn't see an I squared value either in there. And Rory says in the chat, not just a small pool of studies, but also small sample sizes total, or small sample sizes within the studies, and then also total only 255 subjects and mostly male athletes. Yeah, I think we said only a couple studies, or maybe 2 or 3, had female athletes. And then again, we're talking about different sports and also different levels. So it was all the way from you know, top tier, collegiate, regional. Lots of different aspects to be looking at here. Now, Kevin, when you said a lot of times, this is maybe jumping the gun off of the paper, but a lot of times glycolytic work is programmed either inappropriately or not in a way that's going to elicit the actual response that we're looking for. Do you have an example in your head of when that would go awry?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll kind of tell you again, you know, like I'm not claiming to be, you know, an expert in programming energy system development, but I'll just kind of rattle off my thoughts and how I kind of think about it, and then you know, please correct me for anybody in the crowd or, you know, whoever. So to me, when I think about energy system training, it kind of comes down to a balance between oxygen delivery and oxygen utilization. And we know that like kind of the classic model of, you know, you'd use creatine phosphate system or alactic for this to this, and then it goes into this. It doesn't operate in that manner. We're always using them all at the same time. But I think kind of thinking of it from like a sports perspective, trying to maximize resilience comes down to buffering hydrogen ions and then kind of blowing off CO2. So I think the classic HIIT work is prescribed poorly. And what I mean by that is it's designed to be unsustainable work for the times that you're working, but it also needs to be repeatable. And I think that's where people go wrong. So at the point where you're no longer, then that's kind of where you get into this idea where you're no longer really training the system or promoting the desired adaptations for the degree that we can actually kind of do that, that you desire. So I think a good example of this would be if you have someone where they feel like the rest period that they're provided is too long, then they probably were not working at an unsustainable pace, or they may just actually lack the actual ability to express the amount of power that is needed during that work period. And then the other example that I would give is if the effort is not repeatable, where you can't either keep the times consistent across the work that you're doing, if you're thinking something that's kind of mixed modal, or if you have a certain power metric that you're monitoring, if you're unable to consistently keep that, where the power output is continually dropping across times to completion, or the time to completion kind of consistently rises in the first example, that to me would suggest that the person either cannot produce the power that you're asking them to, or they simply don't have a good understanding for pacing for the task. And that's going to alter or negatively influence the physiological demands that we're trying to kind of produce in terms of HIIT training or glycolytic work.
So it's blowing your gasket. A lot of times blowing your gasket too soon or not enough, right? Did you, when you're looking at these protocols, are these things that you, or similar things that you have implemented in then kind of the way that they've implemented it? Or I guess a better question is they kind of bucket high intensity interval training into 3 different categories in the beginning: the traditional high intensity interval training, sprint interval training, and repeated sprint training. Had you considered that model before?
So I wasn't necessarily totally familiar with some of the terminology that they use. The way that I've kind of looked at like glycolytic work is more like kind of like glycolytic power, which is going to be much more kind of short duration burst and actually shorter recovery time periods. And then there's kind of glycolytic or anaerobic lactic capacity, where you're kind of extending out those maximal efforts and therefore kind of extending out the rest periods too. So that's kind of the delineation or distinction that I've made in terms of like glycolytic work. Is kind of more power based and then capacity based. So to me, I wasn't necessarily familiar with some of the stuff that they reference, but I think if you look at some of the dosages based off of some of those, they kind of still fall into like those 2 buckets.
One of the questions that actually spurred this whole thing is kind of the rest to work ratio and how specific that needs to be. Like that's actually one of the questions that Shelby was asking in the forum that spurred the suggestion for this paper. And it doesn't have to be combat sport athletes at this point, but they actually do in the discussion kind of delineate some work rest periods based on the type of combat sport. Well, we could take that into field sports and that type of thing too. When you're programming this type of thing, are you thinking about trying to tailor your energy system development training to work rest ratios that you think are sport specific? Like just the work rest ratio itself, if you're a wide receiver, it's like, okay, they run route for like 3 seconds and then they stop for 30 seconds between plays. And that's the way that I'm going to structure their HIIT training on the bike, things like that.
I don't know if I would necessarily take it into like the sports specifics. To me, it would be kind of more of a discussion of, well, what energy system are I actually trying to develop, or what sort of adaptation am I actually trying to develop, more so than that, which may be kind of like the same sort of thing. But I would look at it more of like, I understand that we have these parameters that are going to be probably most efficacious to kind of influence this physiological adaptation. That's the way that I would program it, not necessarily to be try to replicate what they're going on in sport, but in a way, I guess it kind of falls into the same sort of thing. So it could just be a little bit of, a difference in phrasing. But I would also say that, yeah, I mean, that's certainly something you have to consider, right? Because I'm not going to give, a marathoner, purely glycolytic work or purely anaerobic lactic work. So there is some of that I think you have to consider. To me, I more so just think about it in terms of what energy system am I trying to develop, and what parameters, work rest ratios, et cetera, do I need to use to kind of to trend the needle in that direction.
So Rory said something that was interesting. And she said that she could understand where Kevin was coming from, but there will be fatigue carrying over from interval to interval, which is the intention. So you wouldn't expect to be able to sustain the same numbers across all the different intervals.
Yeah, I think that's definitely, I would agree with you there, but I think it depends on what degree of drop off or what amount of increase in time are we seeing. Because if it kind of falls beyond whatever that bandwidth that we deem is kind of ideal, then I don't think you're training that specific energy system anymore. You're either making glycolytic work aerobic or something like that. So that's kind of what I would say to that is there's obviously going to be some drop off probably as fatigue sets in. But I think once you kind of get beyond an acceptable time increase or power drop off, I would say that the session should be ended there because you're no longer training that energy system.
What do you think that threshold is, or is there some talk on that? Like if we're going to equate it to hypertrophy training or strength training and velocity-based training, it's like, 20% drop off. But for something like this, is it just kind of, it's all arbitrary, but is it just arbitrary, or is there some data on that?
I know there's data on it, like off the top of my head, I'm trying to think of, what would I consider to be an unacceptable drop off? I would probably, this could be wrong, but I would probably say if we're falling within, anything over 10% is probably way too much. I would say if we're doing like watts on an assault bike or something like that.
You mean 10% overall or 10% between each interval?
Between intervals, yeah.
So you could have a steady drop from interval 1 to interval 10, more than 10% total, but as long as it's like a 3% change between each set.
Yeah, I would say that, no, excuse me, 10% overall, to rethink that, yeah. Excuse me, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's because it's a tough conversation, because the other side of it is in a combat sport land, they're going to be faced with situations in whatever they're on, the mat, the octagon, and the ring, where they're uncomfortably tired, but are going to have to push through to repeated high force, high velocity. Now those forces and velocities are going to be ultimately dropped off because of the fatigue, but the intent is going to still be there. So now you're getting into the whole, well, do you have sessions in there where you allow drop off, but it's more of a grit? You're training the quality of grit now, out of them getting punched in the face or getting choked out, where they can learn how to still put in some really high effort with biomotor drop off, absolutely, but be able to sustain maximal efforts for repeated bouts. And, maybe those things they're thrown in there like we would to anchor anything else, just not as often as maybe a lot of people do. That I'm just kind of throwing that idea out there.
So Joe had a question also. He asked if that the 10% drop in output, meaning the inability to maintain the effort or pace for the prescribed duration. So kind of like the total thing, right?
So it would kind of depend. What was the question again?
So he was saying, is that a 10% drop off in the output, meaning the inability to maintain the effort or pace for the prescribed duration? So with the whole thing versus the interval, I think is the question.
Right. So here's like a good example. Let's say that we were doing like something for distance, and you were going to prescribe it for like 3 trials. And because remember, it has to be unsustainable beyond like the specific time. Right. So let's say that it was, something for distance, and that based off of testing, like their best, their PR record was like, 55 seconds or something like that. And you're trying to develop that energy system. So like trial 1, if they're hitting like, 59, 60, 58, that would be like a showcase of something that was good, or they're executing it well. They're working at an unsustainable pace, but they're also showing that ability to maintain or have repeatable efforts. If it was something where it was like they went 49 and then they went to 65, 70, that would be an indication of someone that is not showing that repeatability, if that answers the question with a little bit more like numbers to it.
So in that case, would you then just take a percentage off of that right from the beginning and say, I want you to be able to stay here
Yeah,
for a
so you
set number of
probably
intervals?
use something, if you know what like their best time is, you'd want them to hold like 95% of that across time trials.
So
So,
Anthony,
yeah.
sorry. Anthony also said that he gave a really good example of using set ranges instead of just a set number of sets, where you can say 3 to 5 sets versus just 5. And then RPE can be a valuable tool when it comes to these kinds of HIIT intervals to maintain that same energy system that you're working.
Yeah, you could do that for sure. And you could still, RPE is, it's useful, but so is an objective rating as well too. So if you're on a bike and it's showing you wattage, that's really useful because you don't have to worry about how tired you feel, because that shit probably sucks regardless. But
I mean,
yeah.
well, yeah, like vomit inducing glycolytic work is like, thankfully I don't do that anymore, but like no one's like psyched for that. So yeah, I think RPE can be tough to use. I think having something a little bit more objective may be better, but it's like you said, if you don't have a watt bike or something, or if you don't have like a PR, 200 meter time or something like that, I think it's tough.
So yeah, go ahead. Were you going to say something, Taylor, or answer a question?
Yeah, we have a bunch of questions actually. So Jordan said, is it a question of being able to stay in a specific energy system, or is it a question of performing under fatigue independent of the system being used?
Can you repeat the question for me?
Yes. Is it a question of being able to stay in a specific energy system, or is it a question of performing under fatigue independent of the system being used?
Probably depends on
Well,
what you're looking to, what the prescription would be. So if you're looking for repeatability, then I would say that it'd be, that ability, that would be kind of like that, more like that alactic capacity, to where you're able to maintain the prescribed output under fatigue, which would be essentially just progression. But it's still the same energy system. I'm a little confused by the question, because the parameters and the work outputs kind of determine what sort of energy system you're trying to bias.
I think part of it is like we're making a little bit of a dichotomy to understand the training and then what they're also going to have to endure in the sport. Okay, we're talking about grueling sports here, specifically with combat sport athletes. So to Jordan's question, is it a question being able to stay in a specific energy system? If you just take that as a standalone, for the sport, well, no, because like Kevin anchored this in the beginning, you're never just in one energy system no matter what. And in the actual sport itself, you're going to just be jumping around all over the place. I mean, the aerobic system is going to be being used throughout. You're going to have quick, explosive bouts of repeated movements, and you're going to have nothing where you're just, they're just kind of fainting and doing all that stuff. So it's both, but in training, you can have those closed days where you say, I want to just hone in on this particular ability, which Kevin, maybe you're saying is, okay, repeatability, power output, repeatability, power output. That's what we're training for this bout. But we know that hopefully will transfer into them being able to tap into many different qualities, which would be number one of those would be, Jordan, performing under fatigue independently, where your total output's probably down, but you're at least able to keep repeating the effort. It's just hard to repeatedly train that way over and over when you're just having those drop-offs. So some of it's about sustainability and training as well from a longevity standpoint, like session to session to session. So it's both, I would say.
So Evelyn said, what about using heart rate?
Yeah. I mean, and the heart rate wasn't all that affected in this particular study because they were just kind of looking at, first of all, these were already pretty trained athletes. It seemed like a lot of them are at pretty high levels. And it didn't look like heart rate was changed all that much. But if you're saying heart rate as far as how to modulate effort, yeah, I mean, that's how they validated RPE back in the day. They correlated it with increases or decreases in heart rate. So you could definitely do that too. It's just that that's not really an output. That's more kind of a response, an internal
It's kind of
driver.
more like an internal loading. I think it gets hard to use heart rate for some of this stuff. You can probably use it from like a recovery standpoint and like terms of like, once you hit below like a threshold of, 110, 120 beats per minute or whatever it may be. I think that's probably valuable that way. I'd have to kind of look into that a little bit more.
Yeah, and Shelby just kind of reiterated that in the chat too. Heart rate and RPE are kind of markers of the internal load, like your body's internal response to the work or to the external stressor that you're putting upon it. But looking at something like wattage or VO2 is your output, or at least wattage is. VO2, might actually argue that that's more of a kind of an internal marker too, but wattage, a jumping height, barbell velocity, these things are kind of physical outputs that then we can kind of chase as metrics to then guide prescription. And then we look at things like RPE and heart rate to see how we're responding in conjunction with the output. But I'd say if you don't have anything else, heart rate is at least something.
Shelby was asking, and going back to the point that Kevin had made on training the energy system rather than the sport. And she said she was curious on y'all's thoughts on this in a wrestler. So assume they're doing 3 sets of 3-minute rounds. It was recommended to me / my coworker to really emphasize glycolytic work. Her thought would be to instead emphasize building aerobic power / capacity and alactic power / capacity, and then a secondary emphasis on glycolytic work. What do you guys think?
I mean, that's kind of my general stance on a lot of stuff. I think that glycolytic work should be kind of reserved for the a majority of your training. I don't think should be primarily glycolytic. I mean, especially if we're talking about from like a rehabilitation standpoint, I think spending a majority of your time in sort of like alactic and developing a huge aerobic base is going to be very good for most things.
So I haven't had a lot of fighters recently, but I had a fair bit. I actually worked before I moved out here to California 5 years ago. My clinic was inside of a combat sports gym. And that's where I worked. So we were seeing a lot of these athletes, and we kind of program these things the way that we program barbell training and squats. We had microcycles of 7 to 10 days, and then we would do different aspects on each particular training day. So we would do short intervals, long rests, like high output for short periods of time, long rests. And then glycolytic work would be once maybe in each microcycle, but we might have multiple aerobic base work or alactic power, maybe twice in there too. And because they're doing their fight training as well. And so a lot of times we wouldn't have glycolytic work if they were already getting a lot of that in their fight camp. So it's hard to talk about these things in a vacuum without also knowing what their sport skill or sport training is doing. But you can kind of bucket it that way. So what Shelby says, basically the same thing, just working on these different aspects. You're just surfing the curve of this spectrum of, alactic power, maximum velocity and force, and then aerobic, and you're just kind of surfing that curve. But I'll stop there.
So Ron actually had something to say about heart rate, which was interesting. And he said heart rate cannot be used for interval or recovery as there is a lag in response. Plus the increase in catecholamine levels does not allow for adequate recovery of the heart rate between intervals.
Mic drop.
And then there's another question going back to Anthony. I've always heard to use minimum effective dose when it comes to intervals with athletes, since you also have to factor in their sport specific training too. So kind of what Quinn was just talking about.
Yeah, and time of year too. If and what they're going to be having to get tested on, like, and I keep going away from the combat sport athletes thing, but it still applies. Like, are they completely out of season? Or they're not doing really any fight work, or maybe they're doing really light sparring, but nothing super live, and they're not doing a whole lot of sports skill right now. Then you can do more in the gym, like for your training. You can kind of expose them to different things. But then as they start to already get that in their sport training, then you can start to taper off, and doubling up on that, you start to kind of taper off on the stuff that they're already getting within the sport itself. And then maybe you focus on, the other things. And maybe you can tailor it to them too. You can say, like, if it's a boxer, you can just tell that they get gassed out when they have to do repeated combinations in the same round. You say, okay, you could just train that through boxing, but you could also train the system, with some power testing on a bike, potentially.
So Aaron had that same kind of question. I hope that answered his too. Different Aaron said he joined late, but do you think HIIT workouts are worth the potential increase in joint stress and other structures? I find that especially athletes training on their own have a propensity to get injured during HIIT.
Aaron, well, okay, yeah. So do you think HIIT workouts are worth the potential increase in joint stress? Well, I guess it depends on what actually you're doing, because a bike or a rower aren't really that stressful. Aaron, are you grouping HIIT workouts with CrossFitters who are doing box jumps and thrusters and running, or anybody else that's doing high intensity, high impact activities within their HIIT workouts? Because that's not the same thing as just high intensity training. Depends on the modality that you're using.
I mean, you could make, mixed modal stuff high intensity too. I would say that's probably for an advanced population, but it certainly doesn't have to be, high joint stresses. Like you said, go all out on an assault bike for 30 seconds and do that 4 times with 4 minutes rest, and you'll vomit everywhere.
Your joints will feel okay, but your soul will be blackened. Got some good. So Joel Jameson's book, people are throwing that out there in the chat.
Mm-hmm. Jordan said, isn't it a bit different of an argument between the two? So training in glycolytics sounds like it's an argument for performance, whereas I think of having an aerobic base would have the biggest impact on recovery between high intensity bouts.
Yeah, I see the point that you're making. I think aerobic would likely help with having an aerobic base would likely help with recovery between intense bouts, but it would also, you need some level of aerobic base to be able to sustain your performance as well. So I don't know if it's totally either or, but yeah, I do kind of see what you're saying. It's hard to know, it's like they need as much as they need. So it's how much of an aerobic base do you need for a particular athlete, and you're just kind of guessing, if it's a MMA fighter who gets gassed out in the 5th round of a championship fight, there's a lot of stuff that could be the reason why. Could be that they take too much. Their conditioning's fine. They take too many body shots. So that's a tactical problem. But if you find that consistently, even in like light sparring, non-live sparring, around that time period that they start gassing out, regardless of how intensely or how many repeated intense bouts they have within that, you can say, okay, maybe this is an aerobic based thing. But if you see, okay, it doesn't matter, first round, second round, third round, they need to take the rest of the round off after they do, an intense combination or two. Like that's consistently happening. Then maybe you think working on their repeatability, like Kevin was saying before. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's an instance where you'd have to like really test to kind of see what their rate limiter is. I don't know if you could, necessarily, like you said, especially from like an actual like a live, like even like live sparring or something like that. I don't know how you could kind of piece out or parcel out, what the true limiter is.
In regards to testing, do you have some outcomes that you would fall back on, like some type of 5-minute maximum aerobic speed for certain energy systems, something for, alactic power, something for more kind of longer duration aerobic? Do you have some KPIs that?
Yeah, I mean, the maximum aerobic speed's a good one. I think another like a 500-meter row for time as fast as possible is another good one.
Oof,
Let's see, like assault bike, max cals 30 seconds, stuff like that. I think those are pretty solid ones. If just taking it from like a more kind of like practical, like real world. I think those are good kind of benchmarks to kind of utilize.
So I used the 5-minute maximum aerobic speed test quite a bit. Like one reason I like that stuff is you can start to prescribe off of that, because you can do one of those tests pretty frequently. Like you could do a 5-minute maximum aerobic speed test once every 7 to 10 days. And like, it's not all that bad. It's, but you can take a percentage off of that now for the next microcycle and overshoot to, for shorter bouts, super maximal bouts, but for shorter duration. Or then you could do like repeats. So you can kind of use that maximum aerobic speed as an anchor to then guide your prescription for the next microcycle. And it always helps you kind of keep a thumb on where they are from a fitness standpoint.
Or even like Cooper's test is another one that's like pretty famous from like exercise physiology literature. I think like a 400-meter, best PR, like best time for 400-meter sprint would be another good one.
Oof. What, can you explain the Cooper test for people?
Oh man, you're going to put me on the spot. I got to look it up. I don't remember what it is.
Yeah, I was going to, well, when you said, I was like, oh yeah, that's a good one. And then I was like going to explain it. And then I was like, well, actually, I haven't actually done it in a while, prescribed it in a while. Taylor can read more questions while
yes. Joe has a couple questions. He said, it probably depends on how much time you have to prepare. If you have 8 weeks, it's different than 20 weeks. And he said if he has 8 weeks, he's not doing much aerobic work. But if he has the time, he would opt to raise the floor of his aerobic base and ceiling of the alactic system. I would think you would see the needle move a little with lactate accumulation and buffering if you're making changes in these areas. And he said correction should have written aerobic capacity rather than alactic, but would also train alactic.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And Joe, when you say if you only had 8 weeks versus 20, you're probably not going to do as much aerobic work. Is that just from an opportunity cost standpoint? You just have enough skill and other kind of systems and repeatability systems and power output systems to work on that they're going to get aerobic work just because they train so much. But that explicitly training steady state aerobic work or whatever it is just an opportunity that could be just time that could be spent on other things. Is that kind of what you're getting at there? Rory says the Cooper test is 12-minute run test.
Yep.
Thanks, Rory.
Ron said the 30 to 15 IFT is a great field test to use to prescribe interval-based training using maximal spread speeds.
Cool. Thanks, Ron.
And then back to Aaron, he wanted to go back to his question about joint stress. And he said he was thinking more about like the high impact of it. So overall, though, with a high intensity workout, when you work closer to max effort, are you not increasing overall stress? I suppose that's relative to the stress of a non-HIIT workout in terms of time or reps.
Yeah, it is stressful, but sport and competition is stressful too. So Aaron, this all comes down to preparation for the goal activity or goal sport. So if you're still thinking, I'm still not quite sure if when you say high impact, you're talking about literal high impact activities like repeated box jumps and those types of things, because if you are, and that's going to be in the sport, like if it is a competitive CrossFitter and that's what they do, then they're going to have to be subjected to that in some capacity. So it's not really necessarily a question of, is it good or bad? It's a question of how can we prepare this athlete in a sustainable way so that they can do these things repeatedly with, minimizing risk. And so it would be the same with combat sport athletes who are going to be going into high intensity, pukable type scenarios in their sport. And then the question is, how much do we want to expose them to that in preparation versus they're going to get subjected to it regardless? These are just questions that you have to ask depending on the athlete. But with your question is just, aren't you subjecting the athlete to more stress? We have to qualify that because stress is the point here. That's what we adapt to. So that's why we train, is we're trying to induce stress. So it just depends on the dose, like Kevin kind of was saying earlier. Got anything else coming up here? These are great questions and great conversation, guys. Thanks a lot. I've learned a ton.
So Anthony said, it's like weighing the odds. Do I need to train aerobic close to season, or would it be more valuable to train small-sided games? My money is on small-sided games to attain that volume and train more sport-specific.
So small-sided games being like for soccer, where you're just closing, you're cramping the field essentially, but you're still getting work, constant work. Yeah, the aerobic thing is interesting because I get the argument, like in barbell sport land, they're like, well, barbell athletes need an aerobic base too, but you don't have to do what we would consider traditional aerobic implements to get aerobic work, just to get sustained elevated heart rate and oxygen consumption can be manipulated within training that looks closer to barbell training than it does to treadmill or bike or rower or whatever. So, yeah, I think the aerobic piece is one that you could probably play around with and get some adaptation with just by manipulating things like rest periods and how you're constraining the activities. I know a lot of the high level boxers that we would work with, they would bring in a fresh sparring partner like every round. And so it was just like, you're always at a kind of a deficit, but like, there's just different ways to kind of manipulate it. As long as your heart rate is, above a certain level for a certain period of time, your aerobic system is being trained. But obviously you can do that explicitly.
If you look at, that's what the best CrossFit athletes are. They're basically just doing aerobic barbell work. They essentially just make it look like normal cyclical stuff. It's pretty incredible. So I think you can get it. It's not necessarily like the implements don't matter, I don't think, in terms of that.
And David said, just because I saw it, sorry, Taylor.
You're fine.
Just popped in front of my face.
You're good.
You said that, isn't that one of the points of the article? Aerobic capacity is in fact an outcome of high intensity interval training. Yeah, I think technically it was aerobic power. Aerobic capacity was a measure in the systematic review, but wasn't actually in the meta-analysis. And they measured aerobic power by going up to a lactate threshold and then trying to sustain that aerobic capacity. There was a lot of things they looked like. Some of this is confusing because a lot of the metrics that they looked at for the systematic review weren't actually what they looked at in the meta-analysis. So these terms are.
Yeah, I saw that too.
Similar.
So, yeah. That confused me too, the aerobic capacity piece of it, because it was, they weren't able to make an inference from it.
So Anya said that she's currently studying for the CSCS, and they recommend work to rest ratios of 112 to 120 for the phosphagen system and 1 to 3 to 1 to 5 for the fast glycolytic energy system adaptations. Does this stand, or is it reductionist for the point of organizing test information?
What do you think, Kevin?
I mean, I think the classic kind of energy system model is not really, I would say, accurate, but I think those are good numbers to kind of give you at least a reference kind of like in the ballpark. If you're studying for the CSCS, just know it.
Yeah. Well, I think yeah, it is reductionist, but so is everything, because we're just trying to make sense of all this stuff. So I don't think it's a bad place to start. And I think it kind of anchors you to at least a point to be able to stand on and say, okay, like I have some context to this. Now let me kind of branch off and think about, all the things that we're talking about here. So if you're seeing, if your tests and your things are repeatable over time and you're seeing change over time, that's a good start. Whether it's training or testing the thing that you actually think it is kind of is always the question that we're trying to strive for. But as long as it's repeatable and you're seeing change, that's a decent place to be too. We're still getting good work.
Leandro said, third waves adaptation, skill-oriented ones particularly, should those be avoided in glycolytic energy system training?
So I don't actually know what third waves adaptation. I'm not familiar with that. Kevin, are you familiar with that?
I'm not. I'd like to know what they're referencing.
Well, just based on the rest of the question, skilled oriented ones particularly, should these be avoided? Leandro, obviously correct us, but it sounds like what you're asking is when you've got a kind of a skill or a coordination or maybe a perceptual based thing, and now it's being affected in glycolytic work because of fatigue and just, decreased output. And now the skill of whatever it is degrading, or the coordination pattern is degrading. Is that bad or should be avoided? It's a good question. So in weightlifting, we aren't really glycolytic ever, unless we do like a set of 5 in the back squat. So if you're doing a set of 4 snatches and you're actually getting tired, and rep number 3 and 4 look way different than rep number 1, your bar velocity is down, your positions are like loose where they weren't, like you're probably not training anything that's going to transfer to the actual sport. But if you're a CrossFitter or a combat sport athlete where technique is, you're going to be subjected to that anyway. It's one of those things where you have to make a decision whether they're going to get exposed to that. So exposing them to that at some point is probably not a bad idea, but also know that they're going to get it in sport.
If that's kind of what they're getting at, I think, again, I'm with you. It kind of depends on what sort of training environment are we talking about exactly. And it's because it could become a discussion of kind of like risk reward, right? Like the worst thing, if you're doing energy system training and glycolytic work with a prowler, like the worst thing that happens is you just pass out and fall over. If you're doing it with like cyclical barbell work, drop in, 115 pounds on your head or something like that. There's a lot more risk, right? So I think it's probably something that's going to be very much sport specific. And if we're just trying to get the adaptations in, there isn't necessarily that sort of, specificity aspect to it, then I would probably choose the safest thing to suffer.
I think the more in tune you are with the individual, the more you can start to toe that line a little bit. But it's hard because you have to know, like you have to push them to create change. So what if a cyclical skilled element is a part of their sport and that's where they shit the bed every time they go into competition? Well, that's a quality that you got to kind of push into, but you've got to kind of be there, because like how much coordination degradation do you want? And, then that dictates how you program it from an intensity standpoint. are they able, like, as a little bit of degradation and then they can like sustain that, that's good? Or then when they get tired, it just all falls apart. Like you really don't know until you watch, until you know the athlete, and then that's going to clue you in on how you can program for that stuff.
So Joe said, probably good to train in both with and without skill depending on timing. For a soccer player, you're evaluating two different things if you do a 5-minute MAS on a track versus with a change of direction every 20 yards.
Right.
I mean, I guess it kind of depends on what's the intent of the session. Is it purely, energy system development, or is it more of a skill work session? Like you said, I think it's probably, there's instances and cases to be made for both. I think it gets hard when we try to talk about, sports specificity in the context of training, just because there's, the ecological dynamic aspects of it, I think, are hard to kind of reconcile.
Mm-hmm. It's, yeah. If you just do something, sometimes I think with this stuff, we try to parse it out too much, and we could do that with anything, obviously. But if you're sort of hitting the mark, like if you have a day that's just the intervals are short enough to go, it's a true sprint, and then you allow them to rest to full recovery, and then you say this day is just repeated sprint trials at high output. It's not glycolytic, it's just high output. Then you have a day where it's kind of it is glycolytic. You have 30 to 60 on, you're matching 1-to-1 rest, or maybe even less, 2-to-1 or something like that, work to rest. And then you're just like sliding the scale on some of these intervals. And then maybe you have a day that's aerobic capacity, or you do like a 15-minute time trial or a 5-minute time trial, and you allow that to anchor you. Like, if you're just doing these things, you're probably ticking off boxes for this athlete. And then if you get an idea of what they're getting subjected to in their practice, like a lot of those gaps are probably being filled. So, and I'm saying this from an outsider perspective, from in regards to energy systems, because I don't deal with this stuff a whole lot, but I'm just thinking about it the way that we try to parse out every little thing. I think that sometimes we can get lost in the weeds a little bit. And I know it's always a cop-out answer, but just do something. I like the idea of having a 7 to 10 day microcycle and having a little bit of a different focus each time, because at least I know I'm ticking off boxes. And then I have these KPIs that, like what you've talked about. I use a 5-minute mass test on a bike frequently, or on a track. And I'll use some of these, like the beep test. So actually I have a couple of people in firefighter training. They're going to have to do the beep test. And we've been doing the modified beep test a lot. And then maybe once a month we'll do the whole thing. So the 5-minute modified, we'll use that as an anchor, just like I do with maximum aerobic speed.
Shelby had an interesting point here too. She said, I think another thing to keep in mind is that certain energy systems will adapt quicker and maintain those adaptations for longer than other ones. For example, with the glycolytic, I believe it can adapt within 2 weeks, and those adaptations can maintain for 7 to 14 days. So using that type of training closer to practice/competition where the athlete might be exposed to that.
Yeah, and where they're not going to be able to sustain that type of training for a long time. But that's a really good point. Actually, one of my people who was into the fire academy training, she's like right on the brink of just joining the academy. You have to do a test before that. That's just a bunch of, it's like 8 different tests, the CPAT or something like that, where you have to wear a 50-pound vest and do all this stuff. And it starts with a 3-minute step test with a 50-pound vest. And it's hard. And and she failed it the first time. And then we said, okay, like, what is this? We started doing a lot of glycolytic work because she felt like, she told me, I felt like I ran a 400-meter dash. I felt like I ran 2 400-meter dashes and I was wrecked for the rest. It only lasts 10 minutes. The whole entire test is 10 minutes long, but that first 3 minutes sets the tone. If you can get through that, then you can cruise through everything else. And so we said, all right, we spent a lot of our time in 1 to 5 minute ranges. And she was, dude, it was 2 weeks later. 2 weeks later, she had to retest and she crushed it. Now, a lot of that could be just familiarity. But to Shelby's point, like, we had a conversation, like, the next 2 weeks needs to be hard. And it's going to be hard. And that's what we did. We essentially just recreated what she wasn't prepared for, and it worked like a charm. But after that, we didn't need to train like that anymore. And so we didn't.
That sounds so terrible, man. That's like 3 weeks of just like dedicated suffering. But congrats, man. That's awesome she passed too.
Right. Well, and you need an athlete who's going to be willing to do that. It's not like she's one of those people who can turn her brain off and just like put the work in if she needs to. And that's exactly what she needed to do. Aaron said, it sounds like I'm not making enough patients puke. Well, no.
So I have a question actually. In relation to barbell athletes, so powerlifters or weightlifters specifically, do you think that one cohort or the other would benefit from high intensity interval training in competition, like training that for competition adaptations? Like, is there any translation that we could have from that to their competition lifts?
You know, if they don't have the energy, like they're getting wrecked by all of their sessions, I honestly don't see the argument for it giving you anything that you couldn't get from just manipulating the barbell training itself. You've just got so much there that you can play around with. Like, you don't have to be Lance Armstrong with your aerobic capacity if we're talking about increasing the aerobic capacity of a barbell sport athlete. Literally just decreasing the rest periods and telling them not to sit is going to elevate their heart rate for an extended period of time. That's probably enough to create some type of capacity, you know, barbell complexes, things at the higher rep sets, you know, these things that they're not used to. Tempo work, just extending time under tension. I'm not convinced. I haven't seen any data that tells me that a direct aerobic training thing that's separate from their barbell training is going to augment their sport performance to a significant degree. If they like that stuff, that's a different conversation. If they just like doing some aerobic work because it like clears their head, it makes them feel good, it gives them that response that a lot of aerobic work does, like, that's totally fine. As long as I don't see it competing with our barbell sport training, then I'm cool with that. But I don't know if that's an argument that everybody across the board would benefit from that very specific type of energy system development training for a barbell sport athlete.
So Anthony said that he likes to use EMOMs and cluster sets for weightlifters.
Yes. So every minute on the minute clusters, that's exactly what I do. You increase the density of the work.
Yep. Escalating density training for sure.
And then Nick had a question. So going with what Shelby said, would that glycolytic work then be something you might focus on more as competition gets closer since the adaptation happens so quickly? And then anti-glycolytic work and aerobic capacity be more things that you focus on farther away from competition since those adaptations take more time?
I mean, that's kind of my position on it. I think that glycolytic work should really only be used for certain populations and for a limited amount of time, just because it's so stressful that I think using it for extended periods and, you know, over and over and over again, I think it just burns people out. So I would agree with that. I think majority of your training time should be spent in in alactic work, whether that's resistance training. And I think the rest of it, the majority should be in aerobic work, especially if we're talking like general population or, rehab clients. I think that's going to give us the most benefit for sure.
And then Ron said, would you say that HIIT can be achieved with barbell training or only with specific modalities? And that was one of my questions also.
No, I think we answered that earlier, just saying you can increase the density of your barbell sport training by manipulating volume, rest periods, the variation of the movement, the tempo. I don't think it has to be only with specific modalities that you would consider aerobic, like a bike or a rower or a treadmill or whatever. You just increase the density of the work and decrease their ability to recover purposely by manipulating rest periods. And, to follow up with that, Anthony said, if we're talking about CrossFitters as barbell sport athletes, then we probably do need some focused aerobic work. And yeah, totally. Well, that's part of the sport. They're going to be required to jump on a rower, to jump on a bike, to do those things, not just as training, but as sport.
Yeah, that was the follow-up that I had to your question, Taylor. Is like, who are we like considering, barbell athletes? Are we talking purely, Olympic lifters, or are we talking, power lifters? Because if it is CrossFit, then they're definitely like huge component of the sport is going to be kind of glycolytic dominated stuff.
Even then, the CrossFitters that I've been around a lot of them, and the ones that fixate on, what the general public probably sees as CrossFit, which is have the puke bucket next to you. And when that's their sole focus of training for no kind of rhyme or reason, and there's no plan or undulation of that doesn't work out all that well. Everything else kind of goes to shit.
So Ron had a follow-up to his. He said HIIT is based on 90% of VO2 max workloads or greater. So what would be your response to stating that resistance training and body weights cannot achieve these given workloads as represented within the research?
Resistance training and body weights cannot achieve these given workloads.
It could be maybe it's an operational definition issue. Are we going like textbook is greater than 90% of VO2 max? That's an interesting point. Is it more based off of purely VO2 max, or are we talking, time constraints and work output? I think I'd be curious to kind of hear Ron's thoughts on that. Are we kind of missing the boat in terms of what we're classifying as HIIT?
Is this in response to the aerobic and barbell sport athlete conversation?
Yes.
Just stating that resistance training. I guess I don't quite understand the question in regards to, Ron, can you state your question as a rebuttal to what was talked about? Because I think you're referring to some type of disconnect, but for some reason I'm not seeing that.
Yeah, he said he's going to type it out for us. Ooh, Ron, would you like to be on audio?
Good idea, Jordan. Shelby asked, how long are CrossFit workouts on average? On average, gosh, well, they vary because that's the nature of the sport. But on average, I'd probably say 10 to 15 minutes for your average Metcon. But that varies based on the ability of the person too. Oh, Ron doesn't have audio. And Anthony said 15 to 20 minutes. Yeah. Shelby says that, so then we wouldn't classify CrossFit as HIIT workout, right? Well, a lot of their workouts are not that long. So there's still a lot that are on the minute, every minute on the minute. They're doing a lot of different types of manipulating those variables. So yeah, some of these are prolonged, probably more aerobic, but not all of them. Some of them are just repeat row for 100 meters and then go and do 10 wall balls, and then row 100 meters and then 10 wall balls. Those are pretty high intensity.
So I guess my confusion in kind of regards to Ron's question is, I would classify like glycolytic work as something that is primarily using lactate as fuel for continued work, is maybe the way that I would put that, not necessarily a percentage of VO2 max. Now they may cross over physiologically, I guess.
Yeah, the VO2 max piece was because the original question on barbell training was for aerobic work.
So he said aerobic adaptations are based on percentage of VO2 max. So minimal adaptations that can be seen are at 50% VO2 max. However, to be classified as HIIT, the workloads should be greater than workloads at 90% VO2 max. You can achieve aerobic adaptations with the other workouts, but these can't be labeled as HIIT.
Yeah, so don't label them as HIIT. And I don't know, again, Ron, is this in response to the barbell sport athlete? Because I wasn't considering any of the stuff HIIT. It was more just prolonged periods of elevated cardiac output. And so I think it kind of goes back to maybe what we've talked about too, is just think about the quality that you're trying to train as first foremost, rather than the bucket or model or label, as that's kind of secondary to get your understanding of it.
I see where he's coming from. So he said, I just think it's a misnomer with classifying interval-based workouts as HIIT.
Yeah, for sure. And then Nick says, just to clarify, you might say EMOMs as a way to train barbell athletes aerobically and keep the load light enough and then sustain the work. And then I wouldn't, so every minute on the minute you do, let's say 5 repetitions of a back squat, you rack it, and that's going to take up probably your first 10 or 15 seconds. And then you've only got 45 seconds rest. So like that's sustained work in shorter time periods, but I wouldn't call that high intensity interval training. But I think it'll move the needle on an aerobic base for a barbell sport athlete who doesn't have a really high aerobic base anyway, number one, and number two, doesn't need great changes in their aerobic base either. So anything that's more aerobically based than what they've been doing is going to elicit some type. It's basically beginner gains because they don't have any of that. So you don't have to get super complicated or super intense. Well, Shelby shared something here. Sorry, guys. We're just like looking, the chat's flowing here. So we're all just kind of like digging into it. Oh, Azita, I think Ron got the 90% number from the paper. So I think that's how they had to define, it was a systematic review. So they have to define high intensity interval training. So they used the 90% cutoff to define it that way. That doesn't necessarily mean that's how we all have to define it here moving forward. They just have to set those parameters to answer the question for the particular paper. So just understand that it's arbitrary. Yeah, so Zeta says that too. Do you guys feel like I'm still missing the disconnect?
So I wonder, I'm wondering now, so I was talking more like kind of like glycolytic based work. And I feel like that kind of can encompass a number of things. I do agree with Ron's point in terms of like, if we're specifically talking about designated HIIT training, it does have there is a certain parameter and that needs to be utilized or implemented to be described as that. I think, and if we're talking glycolytic stuff, my kind of, understanding of that is it's, where the primary energy system is using lactate as fuel. So that can be anywhere from, 15 up to 30 seconds and longer. So I kind of wonder if I was missing the boat in terms of, maybe asking or responding to some of the details, specifically using HIIT. And maybe I was referencing HIIT when I was kind of more specifically discussing glycolytic.
Yeah. I got you. So almost using glycolytic and HIIT synonymously, whereas Ron's point is, well, you can't really do that, or you should, right. Or if we're trying to parse this out and define our terms, then we should probably keep that separate based on, that 90%.
Yeah, that's a good point for sure.
So HIIT could be, probably alactic. If you need to, you're just trying to achieve that, it's got to be intense enough to hit that threshold. So it wouldn't be alactic because you got to still get up to 90% of oxygen consumption. Be the other way. So glycolytic work is not hard enough in a certain, not intense enough in a certain respect. Anthony says, if we're trying to build that aerobic capacity, then we would just use that 15 to 20 minute NRAP for volume. Yeah, just 20 minutes of moving.
So Aaron asked, was the NSCA and ACSM definition based on certain results? Would HIIT within the defined parameters differ much from glycolytic work in general?
That's kind of what Kevin was getting at.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was getting at is to me, because HIIT kind of does fall into that, 30 seconds to can last into minutes. Like to me, like it's glycolytic dominant work. So I guess you could say that, HIIT training is glycolytic training, is glycolytic HIIT training. I guess I'm not understanding the distinction from a definition side on my point.
Well, maybe Ron's saying you can't, body weight workouts don't get you there, and resistance training doesn't quite get you there either, because you're constrained by the ability to just repeat the bout. Like instead of being on a bike or a rower where you can just go all out, there's no real constraint to getting you to that threshold. When you're doing, say, a mixed modal CrossFit workout, for example, you're constrained by the skills of the movement. You can't really go all out. Like a kettlebell swing, you got to like decelerate and slow it down a little bit. You can't just like go balls to the wall because the bell will fly out of your hands, or something like that. So maybe that's kind of where we're calling a Metcon, or
the distinction is there is like in terms of like the mixed modal is not actually a way to sufficiently impose the physiological demands to be classified as HIIT training.
So
yeah, are you asking? Yeah.
Just kind of in general, I'm just trying to understand the point.
That's what I take from it, which is fair. If you're a CrossFitter, it's sport specific training. If you're a combat sport athlete, I definitely see, so that's the other piece, is like you'll see combat sport athletes use CrossFit as a part of their training. And so maybe that's now kind of, to Ron's point, maybe those workouts are kind of this weird middle ground where they're not heavy, so you're not producing like peak force or repeated bouts of velocity because you're almost like pacing it. But the skill elements of the movements are enough to almost like constrain the top end intensity that you can hit.
So he answered that here. I think that was kind of the distinction there in terms of like, would you classify like cyclical barbell work or CrossFit work as HIIT, and it's not, because the metabolic demands from the literature don't reach the cutoff for it. So thank you, Ron. That's helpful.
Yeah, I just saw his comment. That makes perfect sense. Yeah,
Anthony
that makes
has
sense.
his hand up. Sorry.
Can you unmute him, or that's on my end?
I think that's on your end. I can only chat with him.
Gotta fix that. All right, Anthony, you should be unmuted.
What's up, guys?
What's up, man?
All right. No, I felt like I was just typing so much in the chat just from like what everyone was saying, just to get my point across, because I feel like I deal with more barbell athletes and CrossFit athletes than I do like, soccer players or combat sport athletes, stuff like that. But I mean, if you look at the history, like some high level combat sport athletes, they develop Fight Gone Bad as one of the workouts, like that was part of the reason, is because it simulated that similar effect that they had when, they actually got the shit kicked out of them.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I mean, I think using CrossFit as a context, it's like the literature that he's probably looking at might not necessarily be the mainstream literature or what people are actually going off of in terms of development for CrossFit. And so it's like, I think about myself when programming classes, it's like, I'm not just going to blast people, with 15 or 20 minutes at work. It's like the other day we came in and this was awful, but it was, 5 rounds, a 2-minute AMRAP. You had to row 150 meters. You had to give me 10 wall balls. You had to do that. And then
I just said that. I made that work up earlier, and then you did.
Exactly. I was gonna try to type it in the chat. You literally said what we did, but you know what I mean? Like, and but we're talking about like sport specificity. So it's like, if we're using CrossFit as a GPP aspect for athletes far out of season, I feel like it's going to be a little bit more applicable. But if we're getting into season, and if I have a soccer player, it's like, I'm not going to use wall balls and push jerks or whatever it is with a soccer player or a combat sport athlete. It's like, I'm going to put them in a simulation and have them work for 7 minutes and then, rest or whatever it may be. You see what I'm kind of floating with here. So it's like, I totally agree with you guys, but I just wanted to clarify, like on my end, where this is coming from, where I do think it can still be classified as high intensity interval training, because CrossFit also goes as far as like, you might come in and it might be a 4x400 meter sprint for the day. So it's just context driven, I feel like.
Yeah. And I think to Ron's point, or to his question, if you're using CrossFit to train for CrossFit, or using CrossFit to train for another sport or another modality. And also, CrossFitters, or at least the competitive ones, don't just do the CrossFit workouts that were probably studied in that paper that, where VO2 max is hovering in that kind of moderate 64% area. They're also doing just straight row intervals or bike intervals. So they do that stuff too. But I think for a coach, it can still help to model these things separately sometimes. So if you in your mind want to just define high intensity interval training as greater than 90% of VO2 max, that's great. But, are you also measuring VO2 max to know when you're there, or what's your surrogate?
I've yet to find CrossFit gyms that can test VO2 max on all their members. So.
And we might say, yeah, right. Shelby basically, so she says the HIIT definitions in the paper are different than the ones in the IG post that she sent earlier. So that's one problem. We haven't defined high intensity interval training, or at least there's different definitions depending on where you look. And then she says, I think the distinction may have to do with the duration of the intense work. For example, glycolytic work may be 20 seconds on, 60 off, where high intensity interval training based off the protocol shared on that Instagram post may be 4 minutes all out on a bike. Yeah, which she says that's confusing because it seems difficult to believe one could work at a high intensity for 4 minutes. Well, you can work at a high perceived intensity, but your output's probably just going to taper off. Like if you're truly going all out, but we use that, that 5 minute maximum aerobic speed test is 5 minutes long, but it's pretty much understood that you're not truly going literally as hard as you possibly can for the entirety of that 5 minutes, but it's on the average, you're trying your hardest. And what happens is you kind of like start pacing it before you're realizing it. And then you've got somebody there, no, go, go, go. And then you got to go hard again. But that's why it's maximum. That's why it's an average of those 5 minutes. You're just kind of taking that as a proxy. So if, again, in the sport, if you're talking about a fighter who's going to have to do things for an extended period of time, or at least 2 or 3 minutes of work, getting them to at least try to sustain a level of work in that interval, you're probably ticking off a box there. Whether it is truly, high intensity, you can measure that.
So if we are having a hard time defining what HIIT actually is amongst the entire field of exercise science, could this lead to misleading data or misinterpretation of data?
Yeah, but that's pretty much sports science in a nutshell. We don't have.
I think we have an operational definition though, right? I mean, based off of what Ron said, ACSM is greater than 90% of VO2 max, right? So it could be just a misinterpretation, because I would propose that that's probably like the true definition, right? From that accrediting body, I would say that's probably what I would go to if I was asked on, now with this insight, that's probably what I would say the true definition of HIIT would be.
So then you would just try to mirror the protocols that in the literature that get them to 90% of VO2 max or above.
Yeah, I mean, if we were going to say that, okay, I'm doing HIIT work, right? If I'm going to say that I'm doing like glycolytic work, maybe not. But if I'm going to say that I'm specifically prescribing HIIT work, then it should be under the parameters and the prescription of reaching 90% or greater of VO2 max.
But to know that you're getting there, I'm saying, is just mirror the protocol that was used when they were actually measuring VO2 max, but then use heart rate or RPE as surrogates to try to match that effort.
I guess so, yeah. But again, we run into the problems with heart rate again.
It's just tough to use that 90% of VO2 max because clinically, we need another measure to know that they're getting to that particular threshold. We got some references being dropped in the chat. See you, Jordan. Thanks for coming, man.
So
Martin Bukite, yeah.
Aaron said the ACSM site says 80 to 95% of max heart rate as an alternative. Is that potentially a large range? Maybe not. 15%.
It'll get you somewhere in the ballpark. But that helps to answer the question from a clinical perspective. Poor Shelby's brain. What else, Kevin?
This has been a good one, man.
Yeah.
I liked it. For sure. And I wasn't sure how this is going to go because I didn't really have a ton to take away from the paper, to be honest with you. So
I had about 3 minutes of contribution that I had planned on, and that was just reading the protocol of the paper. But yeah, no, and guys too, don't forget, these papers can be confusing sometimes, these systematic reviews, because you're seeing like all this divergent information. Oh, this study showed this, but this study showed this. And it's just like your brain, by the end of the results section, like what is going on? But what it does is it aggregates all these papers, and now you can start kind of pulling them individually. You can look at that big table that shows you the sport and the protocol, and you can start kind of digging into each one of these individually and see what applies maybe to your practice, or it helps to make sense that way. Aaron asked, Quinn, Kevin, and Taylor, do you guys do HIIT workouts for your own fitness sport goals? No, so I don't. I have trained exclusively for the sport of weightlifting, snatch, clean, and jerk for the last decade. And as we mentioned before, I use the sport practice. I manipulate the sport practice to provide kind of more capacity or more sport specificity by just constraining the elements of the variations of the sport rather than having a whole section of my training dedicated to a specific energy system that's not tied into the sport itself. That's what I do.
I guess it depends on what we're defining HIIT as.
Kevin does. Follow him on Instagram. You'll see he runs like 75 miles a week.
So no, I think I spend a majority of my time kind of in the alactic area, and then the rest of it in sort of the more aerobic based. Because all I care about is feeling good and looking good.
Heard. Evelyn asked, oh, what about you, Taylor?
No.
Taylor's a powerlifter.
I try to dabble in a bunch of different things, and I feel like throughout the year, my focus kind of changes on things. So right now I'm doing a little bit more running, not nearly as much as Kevin, but I'll go into like a strength kind of phase, and then I'll go into like weightlifting. And so I kind of like weave in and out throughout those three main things kind of throughout the year, but I don't really do a whole lot of HIIT.
Evelyn asked, can we get a poll on people who are working with combat athletes currently? I'm curious if they use HIIT in their thoughts. So we can't do a poll. Once we've launched this, the poll questions we previously create, and then we have to launch the Zoom. So we can't actually create new questions once we've opened the meeting. But when I worked with combat sport athletes years ago, as I mentioned, we did do high intensity interval training. Even now, after the conversation with Ron, like how we define it, thinking about it, we still did. But we just did we switched up the rest work intervals to try to cover our bases over the course of the microcycle and the macrocycle, to just tick off the box, to expose them to lots of different stressors in that vein, just across kind of the spectrum of aerobic to alactic and everything in between. But what was that paper that Ron just shared? High intensity interval training solutions.
Yeah, solutions to the programming puzzle, which is interesting.
Oh, Martin Burkheit. He's done a lot of good stuff. Thanks for sharing that. So everybody open that. Open that link, or open any link that you want to, because once I close Zoom down, you're going to lose these links.
This has been a good one, man. Got a paper out of it.
Yeah, buddy. Maybe I'll do some more. I'll do some more HIIT after this.
Perfect time to start.
Keep us updated on that.
It's not
Chronic training load, just bottoming out.
It's not gonna happen. Cool. All right, guys, this was good. A reading HIIT. Yeah, there you go. So he's about to go do a reading HIIT. That's funny. I like that though. Interval, read your papers in intervals. High density.
High density instead of high intensity.
Yep. All right. Well, I think we'll call it 70 minutes. Oh no, 100 minutes later. Thanks for the conversation, everyone. I got a ton out of it. That's for sure. I'm coming out of this thing way more. Yeah, I'm glad it was helpful for you, Shelby. Thanks, Shelby, for putting the paper out there for us and getting that topic started. Thanks, Kevin and Taylor, for helping. This was awesome. You guys were tremendously helpful carrying me along.
This was fun, man. Topics? Anybody got any topics? See, hamstring rehab keeps missing out.
You know, we might have to just do that. I thought, it was eccentrics that we did, wasn't it?
Yeah.
We talked a lot about hamstrings, but it was eccentric. So hamstring rehab, I mean, I do have my Nord board now.
That's right.
So thing's hard. Fatigue makes a big difference too. Like when if I test before I come in the workout and I do the Nord board, and then I test after I do a workout, it's a big difference, like 30+%.
Well, I mean, that would be consistent with the hamstring literature too.
Yeah. Except fatigue doesn't matter.
That's right.
That's not how you get.
We're talking about ACL. It doesn't matter.
Yeah. Okay.
I like Aaron's suggestion. Balancing multiple sports, like a hybrid training.
So Aaron, what type of so this is a journal club, so we have to get papers out of it. And so if we were going to do a search on PubMed or Google Scholar, what would be the terms that we would be searching for? Sport specialization versus sampling? Is that kind of what you're getting at? Or multi-sport athlete? Like in a collegiate setting or high school maybe? It's a tough research question.
Yeah, it's a tough one.
I think it would come down to specialization versus sports sampling. You probably have to whittle it down to something to do with that, right? Developmental.
We could do like a long-term athletic development.
Yep. Cool. All right. Well, we'll keep that. So hamstring rehab, long-term athletic development are two good topics to start with. Kevin's been wanting to do hamstring rehab for like
we'll pass on that. That's been like 6 months. So this.
I want it. It's good.
No, the hamstring research, just no one's interested. We'll let it pass.
I'm interested.
We can do female athlete triad too. Yeah, that's actually like, that was in the forum. It's actually like perfect timing because I'm doing like a bunch of Red S stuff right now. So I'm actually going to throw my file up there in the forum because I think someone posted it. So there's a bunch of literature for that. So we could do that.
Cool.
Yeah, I think the triad was one of the ones that we pulled for this one, actually.
So you got some hamstring support there from Azita, Kevin.
I'd be interested in that too.
See? All right. We've got some topics to vote on at least for hamstring to lose again.
I wrote it down.
We'll just have to pick it one of these times and just say, all right, we're doing hamstring.
Oh man, I mean,
it's a good topic.
It is a good topic, but.
And I'm kind of confused on it sometimes. Like, I don't know, does hamstring strength matter? Does it not? Who does it matter for? So I think it would actually be really good to parse out.
Oh, there's oh, no, there's not.
I think that's it. All right, we'll call it. Thanks, guys. That's good. No, we got some topics out of it, got some papers. We'll post this one up. You guys we'll post it up in the forum, but you'll also have access to the recording for a week after we send it out in a few days. So.
Cool. Thanks, guys.
All right.
Yep. See you guys.
Bye.